Good morning, everyone. This is Father Kilian speaking. I'm glad to have a chance to be with you this morning. And I also am grateful to Brother Damien, who held class for you on Monday. And I hope you enjoyed his presentation. It was a great way to begin the sort of the study of the rule and the monastic sort of traditions, with Brother's insights and his sharing his own experiences. Well, I thought what I would do would just give you a very brief sort of background on Saint Benedict himself, and it's always a bit sketchy, even though much of the information we have on Benedict comes from Saint Gregory the Great, who was actually a relative of Benedict and was also a member of the Benedictine Order. However, I don't believe the two men actually were acquainted with one another, since when Benedict was abbot and living in mature years, I think Gregory was just a young child of 2 or 3 years of age, according to the dates that I have anyway. What's important about the contribution of St. Gregory the Great is that he was familiar with several of the disciples of Benedict. When he himself became a Benedictine, he was aware of some of the older members of the community who were contemporaries of Benedict, and it's from then that he received many of his accounts and stories of Saint Benedict. For example, 2 or 3 of the eyewitnesses one of them was Abbot Constantine, the first successor of Saint Benedict in the monastery of Monte Cassino. Another was Abbot Honoratus, who was abbot of Subiaco at the time of St. Gregory. So it was from these various individuals and disciples of Benedict, and several others, that Gregory received the bulk of his material in relating the life of Benedict. This material is found in the second book of St. Gregory's Dialogues. And really, it's more a character sketch rather than as we know, a biography in the traditional sense of biography. St. Benedict was born in the year 480 at Nursia, sometimes pronounced as Norcia, a city in southern Italy. He was descended from a noble Roman family which numbered amongst its members several generals and senators and rather prominent people of the day. Benedict had a twin sister whose name was Scholastica, to whom he was very close. Little is really known of their early life other than the fact that Benedict was distinguished for his deep piety. St. Gregory tells us, as he heard from some of his disciples, that even in his youth Benedict manifested the mind and the disposition of a mature man. When Benedict was about 14 years of age, his parents placed him in a school in Rome to have him educated in the fine arts. This time in Rome, the great metropolis of the time, was a turning point in Benedict's life. At this time, both church and state were in a most deplorable situation. All bonds of order seemed dissolved, civil laws and authority done away with. The church was infected with heresies and schisms. These unsteady conditions and ever-changing circumstances were most detrimental to the church. Thus, the land in which the first disciples of Christ had preached the gospel of justice and peace became prey to heresy and barbarism. It was therefore necessary that the world was in great need of restoration. I think we can say with a degree of certainty that the enormous work of conversion was in great measure effected by Saint Benedict through the organization of his renowned order of monks in the West. It was the work of Benedict and his monks that established a firm, balanced Christian world upon the ruins of a corrupt, dilapidated Roman Empire. In so many ways, it was Benedict and his monks who brought light and hope to a darkened world. One historian said, I quote, It is amazing how divine providence has manifested its care for the Church by calling St. Benedict for this great work, because at the very time when all Italy, France, Spain, and the northern coasts of Africa were in possession of the Goths and Vandals, and almost the entire East was infected with heresy, in this frightful darkness, so bright a light shone forth from St. Benedict and his order. It was rather obvious that St. Benedict realized and recognized the surrounding area and what he found to be rather deplorable. And it was this, even at such a young age, he decided he was going to leave his studies and go off and find solitude someplace. And so Benedict left Rome, he left school, resolved to find a place of solitude and peace, away from the chaos that surrounded him. The next 3 or 4 years Benedict spent in solitude, broken only by occasional communications with the outside world and by the visits of his friend and spiritual father Romanus, a monk of a local monastery. He then lived in a cave in Subiaco and was given a monk's habit by Romanus. And it was Romanus who recognized the saintly character of Benedict, and he served him faithfully, brought him food and drink. Surprisingly, even though Benedict was pretty much isolated and he intended to live the life of a recluse to some extent, but for some reason many recognized his saintliness and his holiness, and so they were very, very much attracted to him and to the lifestyle he was establishing. In fact, there was one of the local monasteries, the abbot had died, and so the monks came to Benedict and they asked him if he would come to be their abbot. And so reluctantly he did, and unfortunately it didn't work out too well. I think he was imposing perhaps a much stricter lifestyle than they were used to, and so they were rather unhappy with him. In fact, one of the monks, or maybe a couple, decided to get rid of him, so they put poison into one of his into the bread that he was eating. And as the story goes, there was a crow on the windowsill, and as Benedict was about to eat the poison roll or muffin, the crow flew in and snatched it out of his hand and saved him from a death of poison. That's why we oftentimes see, for example, if you notice the statue alongside of the Abbey Church of Benedict, and there is a crow on his shoulder. So that's a kind of an association there. However, some people think that's Ivor's captain, and that's a seagull on top of the statue. Of course, that's not the case. It's Saint Benedict. So as time went on, and as more people came, men came to join him, he established small cell communities, and he appointed one of the brothers to be sort of superior of these communities. And before long, he had almost 12, almost a dozen or more of these small communities establishing these monastic sort of cells, as they were called. With the surprisingly rapid growth of these monastic communities and for the need for a larger place, Benedict moved to Cassino, and it was there that he wrote his rule. We're told that he wrote it. It took him something like 3.5 to 4 years to write the rule. It's important to remember that Benedict wrote his rule for laymen, not for clerics. The saint's purpose was not to institute or establish an order of clerics with clerical duties and offices, but rather an organization and a set of rules for the domestic life of such lay people who wish to live such a life as fully as possible. Another characteristic feature of Saint Benedict's rule is its view of work. His order was not established to carry on any particular work or to meet any special crisis in the church, as had been the case with many other orders. With Benedict, the work of his monks was only a means to goodness, to salvation. His thinking was this: the great disciplinary forces for human nature is work. Idleness is its ruin. Work was the first condition of all growth and goodness, according to Benedict. Idleness is the enemy of the soul. In the regeneration of human nature, in the order of discipline, even prayer comes after work, for grace meets with no cooperation in the soul and heart of an idler. Work is not, as the civilization of the time taught, the condition peculiar to slaves. It is the universal lot of humankind, necessary for their well-being as human beings. Thus, during the life of Benedict, we find what has ever since remained a characteristic feature of Benedictine houses. The members take up any work which is adapted to their peculiar circumstances, any work which may be dictated by their necessities. Thus, we find the Benedictines teaching in poor schools, in universities, practicing the arts, working in agriculture, undertaking the care of souls, or devoting themselves wholly to study. No work is foreign to the Benedictines, provided only that it is compatible with living in community and with the performance of the divine office. This freedom in the choice of work was necessary in a rule which was to be suited to all times and all places. You'll notice as we get sort of into the rule itself that the first chapter talks about the types of monks that one would find in a monastery, and chapter 2 about the necessary qualities of the abbot, or if it's a woman's community, the abbess. What's interesting about St. Martin's right now is that we're presently in the process of selecting a new abbot. You might have heard that Abbot Neil has resigned, and after many years as serving as abbot, and so now we need to look for a new member of the house to take on the position, the role of abbot. And I just wanted to read a couple of things. You'll notice in the rule itself, both chapter 2 and chapter 64, and there's another chapter as well, but these two chapters talk about the kind of person that is best suited as an abbot. For example, from chapter 64, talking about the election of an abbot, which we're presently going through. And it says, and I quote, "Once in office, the abbot must keep constantly in mind the nature of the burden he has received, and remember to whom he will have to give an account of his stewardship. Let him recognize that his goal must be profit for the monks, not preeminence for himself." In other words, the role of abbot is not some kind of a pompous sort of position that one holds, but rather it's a position of service, and it's a very difficult task, and it takes, in some ways, a very strong, self-possessed individual. And for example, in the same chapter 64, it goes on to say that this person is to distrust his own frailty and remember not to crush the bruised reed. By this we do not mean that he should allow faults to flourish, but rather, as we have already said, he should prune away with prudence and love as he sees best for each individual. Let him strive to be loved rather than feared. And I think that's really an important, quality. I've, in my time at St. Martin's, have lived under 6 different abbots, and I'd have to admit there was 1 or 2 of them that I was rather frightened of, and I think that's probably my own sort of prejudging or my naivete. But I think the abbots that were the most successful were the ones that the brothers in the community really respected him and were not fearful of him as such. And just to go back to chapter 2 for a moment, there's a couple of things that I wanted to point out. It speaks about the role of the abbot, the qualities that the one should have. One of the points is that he must point out to the monks all that is good and holy more by example than by words. So that's really a sort of a key characteristic, that is through the example of the person, not so much of his sort of dictating what one should do or one not should do. Also, another characteristic is that the abbot should avoid all favoritism in the monastery. In other words, he shouldn't have sort of special friends. Sometimes that happens when in community, people kind of just cling together, and that's not a good thing. That there should be this openness to everyone. You shouldn't identify an abbot's a special personal friend. And as the rule says here, a man born free is not to be given higher rank than a slave who becomes a monk. Again, keeping in mind when this was written, at the time when slaves were part of the society. The abbot is to show equal love to everyone and apply the same discipline to all according to their merits. So these are just some of the characteristics that I think are important that you would find, that he must know what is difficult and demanding. He must be aware of the individual needs of some of the monks and must be careful about all of that. So it's a tough job, and I think it's really important that an individual who is elected by the community to serve as abbot has a tremendous responsibility. In chapter 1, you have the chapter is titled Types of Monks. There are basically 4 types of monks that the rule recognizes. There's the Cenobites, the Anchorites, the Cerebites, and the Gyrovagues. And it's pretty obvious that Benedict thinks that the Cenobites are the best type of monks. These are the monks that live in community together, and they follow the rule as you have most likely before you, and they commit themselves to the monastic life and to the mission of the abbey, and also under the obedience of an abbot that they have selected. So that's the kind of monk that Benedict suggests is sort of the ideal monk. There's also another type of monk known as the Anchorite, and usually these we don't have too many of them nowadays, but I think in the earlier centuries, when a monk had lived the life of a Cenobite faithfully for many long years, he was then capable of going off on his own, perhaps living within the monastery cloister, but living on his own and without the support and the need of the community. And the suggestion there is that he has advanced so much in holiness that he has become kind of a hermit. He can somehow manage his spiritual life pretty much on his own. I remember when I first came to St. Martin's, one of the monks had told me that in the early years, probably in the 1930s or so, there was a monk here at St. Martin's who lived the life of a hermit. He basically built himself a small little sort of hut down past, if you've ever been on any of these hikes with me, across the stream, across the river, to the property on the far side. There's supposedly some foundation stones from where this monk lived for maybe 2 or 3 years. And of course, in those days, we had the large gardens and we had the dairy, and so he would come up to the farm and accumulate enough food to survive on, and then go back to his hermitage. The third type is the known as the Cherubite, and these would be the monks that don't follow the rule very faithfully. They tend to be rather soft in character. They very much have one foot, as they say, in the world, and there's a kind of independence about them that they're sort of bucking all the time the rule and the monastic life and the schedule. They kind of want to do their own thing. And then finally, the fourth type of monk is the gyrovague. And these are the ones that seem to go from one monastery to the next, to the next. They're never satisfied. They never somehow have found what they really want. And so oftentimes, occasionally, former monks would come to the abbey, and I think it's always wise to know why they left the other abbey. Sometimes they would say, well, because they didn't get on with their abbot, they didn't like this, didn't like that. That's a sign that that's probably not the kind of person you want to come to the abbey, because he was unhappy someplace else. And he was complaining about the monks or the abbots at another abbey. So they would be the gyrovagues, and probably don't have a monastic vocation, and probably should not be in a monastery. For your next assignment, I'm going to give you 3 questions to reflect on, and then I would ask you to select just 2 of the 3. And when you think about that and reflect on it, I'd like to ask you to post your responses on Moodle in the discussion board. And if you could do that by this coming Monday, April the 6th, that would be great. The first question I'd like to have you think about as a possible choice on your part would be from Chapter 5, the chapter on obedience. What I would ask you to think about is, what is the good that is intended to be produced by obedience? What do you think Benedict intended by inviting his monks to take a vow of obedience? And when we think of obedience, sometimes we think of kind of being slavishly responsible to people, to someone. And I don't think that's what Benedict had in mind. What do you think he intended to say when he calls his monks to obedience? And as he says in the chapter, he says that the monks no longer live by their own judgment, giving in to their own whims and appetites. Rather, they walk according to another's decisions and directions, choosing to live in monasteries and to have an abbot over them. What do you think about that? What do you think Benedict intended by that? The second the question that I want you to think about, if you decide to choose it, and that is from Chapter 6. And I think it's called The Restraint of Speech, or it's a very brief chapter, but it's about the importance of silence. And as Benedict says here, the prophet indicates that there are times when good words are to be left unsaid out of esteem for silence. What do you think Benedict intended by that? Why is silence so important in a monastery? Why do we have so many hours during the monastic day that are devoted to silence? Why does Benedict insist on silence? What is your response to that? And the third question that I'd like you to think about, if you so select this one, and that is from Chapter 7 on humility. You'll notice in that chapter, it's one of the longer chapters, Benedict lists the 12 steps of humility. What I'd like to have you do is to read through those 12 steps of humility and see if you can find a sort of a common essence of all 12. What is Benedict essentially saying about humility? Why is humility important within a community? How would you best define humility as you read those 12 steps? What's Benedict saying here?